Hello and welcome to this video series on animal health and biosecurity brought to you by Farmers Weekly. I'm Janine Ryan, editor of Farmers Weekly, and in this series we bring you experts in the fields of animal health and biosecurity. My guest today is Dr. Lia Rotherham. Thank you, Lia, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start off by just talking about your role at the ARC.
So I'm employed as a senior researcher at the ARC, and my role very much entails looking at avian influenza and Newcastle disease and the spread of it around the country, the introductions into the country, and what we hope to do about that. Other parts of my roles looking at diagnostic and vaccine development. So how can we improve the diagnostics that we have, not particularly just avian influenza, but all animal diseases, as well as are there ways that we can improve vaccines for better take-up, for more efficacy, and just general, protecting our herd and flock health in the country.
So can you briefly explain what Newcastle disease is as well as what avian influenza is?
Okay, so both Newcastle disease and avian influenza are both poultry diseases that have huge impacts on our poultry production. Not only in South Africa, but in Africa in general, being as we're not like one of the first world countries, we rely heavily on chicken protein for food. So avian influenza is an influenza A virus. So there's 4 types of influenza viruses that affect, but only influenza A viruses have been known to affect birds. It causes a variety of different symptoms, so it's not as easy to say, oh, that's influenza without doing testing for it. It's a disease that spreads really rapidly. It can spread usually by the oral fecal route, so that means where a bird is passing the virus out through its digestive system and other birds are feeding on food that is contaminated with this fecal material, or even on water that has this fecal material in it. It's aerosoled, so they can pick it up via the respiratory tracts. They can pick it up through people movement, equipment movement, from an infected house to a clean house. It goes onto your clothing, it goes into the bedding, it goes onto feathers. It's quite a nasty little thing to try and get rid of. Newcastle disease is an avian orthoavula type 1. It's got varying types of strains come in it that come in varying severity, and the effect on the birds is very much dependent on the age of the bird, the immunization of the bird, as well as just the general bird's health that comes in. So the strains that can affect them can be mild, where you wouldn't even know that your birds have been infected, to a slight drop in egg production, to ruffled feathers, to a very severe form that would cause mass mortalities amongst the flocks that do them. Again, Newcastle virus spreads very much the same as avian influenza through the oral fecal route, movement of people, equipment amongst the different houses. It has been known to have an aerosolized route as well, but it's not very common. And it does have, I'm presuming, on the farmers' livelihoods and stuff, it has massive impacts for them.
So both these diseases are highly contagious.
Both of the diseases are highly, highly contagious, and they obviously, once you get a suspect form of this virus on your farm, it has to be notified to the Department of Agriculture and the state veterinarians immediately.
And what are some common symptoms that farmers can look for?
With avian influenza, you can, depending on the strain that you're getting, if you've got a high path strain, it's not going to be the easiest thing. They would get respiratory distress, but in a high path strain you get very high mortalities. So one bird could show respiratory distress, and within a 24-hour period you could have a whole house that's died. To a very low path strain where you might notice a drop in egg production, to slight respiratory issues. So there's a wide range of clinical symptoms that you would look at. Newcastle disease is very much the same. In a mild strain, you might find a few ruffled feathers. They might have like a lack of eating, a lack of appetite. To the more severe form, where they would get neurological signs, their heads would twist, their necks would start to twist, their heads would lie between their legs, to onset of rapid mortality without any warning.
So both these diseases have very high mortality rates, which is why testing, I presume, is so important, because it's difficult to diagnose without testing, and it may
So
not
there's a lot
necessarily
of
be.
what they call differential diagnoses that could be done. So there's a lot of other respiratory diseases that could mimic signs that look like avian influenza. Avian influenza and Newcastle are very similar signs, very similar clinical signs. So it's really important when you start to see these clinical signs in the birds to get them tested so that we know exactly what we're dealing with, because there's different measures that can be taken if it's Newcastle as opposed to avian influenza.
And what are the risks of spread? So with avian influenza, it's obviously spread by wild birds, or can be spread by wild birds, which I presume is one of the problems when it comes to actual control of the disease. Are we seeing greater amounts of outbreaks in South Africa, or even Africa at large, at the current moment? Because I know in the world, obviously, at the moment, there's a big avian influenza problem.
So recently, from about 2017, we have been plagued by the high path outbreak that's been seen across many parts of the world currently. It comes from a lineage of viruses that are highly pathogenic, and they've recombined and reassorted to take genes from like other avian influenza viruses to make it stronger. This virus has been causing mass mortalities from China to Russia to Europe to America and in Africa. So we've had two different strains of this virus that have caused two very, very big outbreaks that have resulted in large mortalities of not only wild birds, but it's caused like a huge impact on the poultry industry, simply because one of the control measures for this is we have to cull the birds for the high path strains, because it's the only way that we can prevent that spread of that disease going forward. Wild birds obviously are our biggest threat. Once they come into the farm and they get into contact or they're carrying the virus, that's the easiest route of spread from the migratory pathways which cross all over the world.
Yeah, so I mean, it's almost impossible to control that. I mean, I know they are trying to monitor bird movement and so on and so forth, but to try and actually clamp down on that would be...
So we're never going to be able to weed avian influenza out of the wild birds. That's just not something that's a feasible solution to look into. But there are ways that we can protect our own poultry from coming into contact with these wild birds. There's early surveillances going on where we monitor birds when they're coming in via the flight paths, and we do a lot of surveillance systems on these from a diagnostic point of view to test like their fecal matter in particular to see are they carrying the viruses and are they of concern. We obviously, with the Department of Agriculture, watching the disease situation around the world. So once you start seeing these, and we know that it's about time for the birds to start migrating, it's something that we're on high alert for new strains entering. And every time we find a positive, we do molecular characterization on it to ensure what are we dealing with. Is it a new strain? Is it something we've seen? How is it moving around the country? What can be put in place to prevent this from happening?
And what is the cause of the spread for Newcastle? So if we talk about migratory birds in terms of avian influenza, how does Newcastle get from one farm to another?
So Newcastle from one farm to another is very much going to be a breach of biosecurity. So it's Newcastle, although there are strains of it that are prevalent in wild birds, it's generally not the strain shared between poultry and wild birds. So you will see there's a lot of very similar viruses in pigeons, and pigeons die from them. It's called pigeon paramyxovirus. It is a strain of Newcastle virus, but it's not the one that affects our poultry. The poultry spread is mostly through people moving contaminated material. It could be in the form of feathers, it could be in the form of eggs moving from farm to farm, it could be in the form of moving a chicken that's got very mild clinical signs or no clinical signs at all. People and their clothing going from an infected house to a clean house, or from an infected farm to a clean farm. If you're not washing your boots properly, vehicles, if you're not cleaning the bottom of the vehicles and the tires coming off, that's all ways that these diseases can spread from one farm to another.
So biosecurity is basically essential to stop the spread of the disease. So if I suspect that one of my chickens are infected with either one of these diseases, what should be the first step that I take?
Okay, so generally, one of the first steps that you take if you think you've got one of the diseases on your farm is you immediately have to notify your state veterinarian or your Department of Animal Health, whichever. If your state veterinarian is obviously not available, then you notify your state office that you think you have the disease on the farm or there's a suspected case of it, so that samples can be taken, sent to one of the accredited labs that can then test for the diseases and then let you know exactly which one it is. Then it would obviously be up to the state vet offices and the Department of Agriculture on how they control the disease on your farm.
And in terms of bird care, so with a lot of the other diseases, they talk about isolating the animal. Does that also apply to?
Yeah, so both with Newcastle and avian influenza, the minute you see a bird with any signs of respiratory distress or that, the first thing that you would do is isolate it from the rest of the flock, so that if it is something that is highly contagious, you might be able to spare some of the flock from getting infected.
And so you were talking about biosecurity earlier. So what are the most essential or prevention steps that farmers can take in implementing at least some biosecurity on their farms to try and prevent the spread of this disease or these diseases?
So one of the good things that farmers can do in terms of biosecurity is to make sure that you've got foot baths and clean boots, so that boots that you wear inside a house are not the same boots that you wear outside a house. Changing clothing before you're going from one poultry house into another poultry house on the same farm or different farms. Spraying vehicles off when they're entering and leaving the farm. Ensuring that you've got a good source of food. So some of the feedlots where you might have the chickens could get contaminated from the wild birds. So make sure that your poultry, your feed and everything is in enclosed places and protected from having direct contact with any wild birds. Try and stop wild birds from being able to enter your houses, from eating the food and drinking the water that's accessible to your poultry. Those are the kind of things that people can do. Good hygiene, making sure that you've got strict movement controls of who's entering and who's leaving a farm. I mean, you don't really want somebody from an unknown place to just randomly come into your farm. You don't know where they've been, what they've been in contact with. So it's those kind of things, monitoring equipment, even making sure that you're washing it down when you're moving from one poultry house into another poultry house.
So it's sort of simple steps that people can take. It doesn't need to be expensive or complicated. Can you talk about some of the ongoing research at the ARC in terms of diagnostics or research into these diseases?
So there's obviously a lot of diagnostic work that happens with these diseases at the Agricultural Research Council. So we both do molecular diagnostics as well as serological diagnostics. We work with some of the state veterinarians to do disease surveillance on wild birds. So they would collect fecal samples and submit it to us, and we test for the presence of either of the diseases in the fecal matter. And that's done routinely. So day in and day out, you will be receiving avian influenza, Newcastle surveillance samples coming in and out. We make sure that the tests are fit for purpose. So we look into are they picking up the current strains that are circulating. We do molecular characterization of the strains that are coming in. So every positive sample we sequence to try and see what is it? Is the strain changing? How is it changing? And in the case of influenza, is it moving towards a state where it could become infectious to people? That's something that's really important to take into account, especially with the type of virus that influenza is, where it can change and adapt. And it has been known in the past, it's never occurred in South Africa, where the avian virus has gone into swine, and from swine it's moved into people. So those are the kind of things that we do need to keep an eye on, just to make sure that everything is safe, and if the virus is present, that it's not going to have a huge impact on people too. There's enough losses for the farmers in terms of production loss, job losses, trade losses when they get these infections on the farm. The last thing you want is human life lost because of disease. In terms of other research that we're doing on Newcastle and avian influenza, we're looking currently into machine learning. So can we use information from past outbreaks, from climate change, from resource availability to try and predict when these viruses would present these outbreaks to us. So can we do things better to try and prevent them from occurring using machine learning, because that's where research is moving to. It's the fourth industrial revolution that we're all moving towards, using machine learning. would this be able to help us better predict vaccination strategies for farmers in terms of Newcastle? So, okay, all the climate conditions are ripe for an outbreak. Is it now maybe time to start vaccinating? What is the immunity amongst the birds once you've vaccinated them to getting the disease? So those are all the kind of things that we're kind of looking into. The research is still very much under developmental phase, so it's not something that's going to come out in the next 2 or 3 months. It's going to be a process. We're looking in particular for Newcastle disease at different vaccines, so vectored vaccines, recombinant vaccines, seeing if there are better vaccines out there than the current ones that we're using, and could it become cheaper for the farmers to use as opposed to the expensive vaccines that we now have to use for poultry.
And sorry, just in that vein, is there a vaccine for avian influenza?
So currently, we're not allowed to vaccinate against avian influenza at the present state. It could change going forward. There's a lot of discussions that are going on worldwide currently about vaccination for avian influenza so that we could stamp out this high path H5. But there's a lot of considerations that need to be taken into account for this. But currently, we don't vaccinate against avian influenza.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this episode. Happy farming!